move the font back a little. So here. The name of my story tonight is called A Small Miracle. And it's actually from a book written by Peter Collinson. And the part of the old woman is played by Elizabeth. Her Sunday school class has been practicing this. So Elizabeth is playing the old woman, and Barabbas is playing the part of the shopkeeper. And Hammond is playing the part of the bad guy. And this is just a pretend story. And I get to change the pictures with this remote control. Here is the poor old, can you see the screen okay? Good. Here is the poor old woman in her bed, and her blanket is very, very thin. "Oh, it's so cold," she said. And she went to the stove and the fire had gone out. And she had no wood to put in there to make a fire. "Maybe some food will warm me," she said. But when she went to the food bowl, she saw that it was empty. "I should walk to the village and I should buy some food." So the old woman went to her money box in the cupboard and she opened it. And the money box was empty. Her money was gone. What to do? She put on her ragged cape, and she picked up her beloved flute. And we'll pretend the little white straw in the picture there is her flute. And she stepped out into the cold, bitter snow of the night. And she began her walk to the village. Her plan is to play her flute down in the village, and maybe some of the people who are doing their Christmas shopping would put some money in her empty money box. And so she walked and walked and walked. She got closer to the village. She came past the church. And she decided to look into the church. And she saw Pastor Ed was in there putting out the nativity figures for Christmas Eve. And then she continued her walk into the village. And she found a cafe. And she stood in front of the cafe and she played her flute. And she had her money box sitting in front of her. Many shoppers passed by. However, no one put any money in her box. The old woman was cold and hungry. She had no money to buy food. She laid her flute down and she spotted a pawn shop. Maybe. The shopkeeper looked at her flute, looked at it closely, and he gave the old woman 7 pennies for her flute. That was not much, but it was all she had. So she sadly kissed her beloved flute goodbye and put the 7 cents in the money box. When she stepped out of the shop, a bad guy came rushing up on a bicycle. The bad guy grabbed her money box and pushed her into the ground into the cold snow. And then he sped off down the road. What is the poor woman to do now? She started to walk back to the village. And just as she was passing the church, the bad guy came crashing out of the church on his bicycle, and in his hand he had stolen the bucket that collected money for the poor and needy. The church's collection for the poor and the needy. How cruel was that of him? And so the old woman grabbed the collection bucket out of his grasp, and she knocked the bad guy to the ground, and he fell into the cold snow. And then she hurried into the church, and she closed the doors behind her, and she barred them shut. and she waited for the bad guy to leave. When she turned around, oh, look what he had done. The old woman carefully put all the nativity figures back in their places. And she picked up all of the money and put every penny of it back in the bucket for the poor and the needy. She kept nothing for herself. And then the old woman left the church to walk back to her cottage. And as she walked, the snow began to fall. And the wind was so cold. And the old woman found it harder and harder to walk in the deep snow. And she fell down. Oh, look. They found her, and they brushed the snow off her cold, cold body, and they carried her all the way to her cottage. The nativity figures lifted her up into the front door, and they put her cold, cold body back on her bed, and they covered her with her thin little blanket. Mary stayed by the old woman while the others ran to find ways to help. The wise men went all the way back to the village, and they went to the pawn shop, and they showed the shopkeeper their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, and the shopkeeper was pleased, and he gave them some money. Oh, excuse me, I got ahead of myself here. There's the shopkeeper. And he gave them some money for some of their gold and frankincense and myrrh. And then the wise men went to the supermarket, and they picked out lots of good food with good nutrients in it. And then they arrived back at the cottage, and they saw that the shepherd had cut some firewood for the fireplace. And they roasted the turkey, and the fire in the stove warmed the cottage. But the old woman was still cold and asleep. When all was ready, they quietly left. As the cottage grew warmer and warmer, the old woman awoke. "Oh," she cried out, "who has done this wonderful thing?" And she ran to her door, and she looked to the right, and she looked to the left, but she saw no trace of anyone. "It is a wonderful miracle," she exclaimed. And she sat down and ate the best Christmas dinner she had eaten in a very long time. And then she went over and picked up her beloved flute, and she began to play. Thank you, God, for all the blessings. This was a pretend story, but the true story is that Jesus Christ comes to every one of us.